Hey folks, my name is Ted Gutierrez. You are watching the Business of Cyber series. I am here with Arely Loya. Very excited to talk about ICS recruiting today. Arely, thanks for taking the time. How are you?
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm excited. I have spoken to a couple of people in the industry who have platforms, and one of the things I wanted to do is really talk about a lot of the information that I've just gathered through recruiting that I thought was helpful that I don't really have a platform to share, right? So I appreciate you giving me one and bringing me on.
My pleasure. Well, you're joining from Los Angeles, right?
Mhm.
Very cool. I'm joining from Houston, Texas. I've actually got COVID right now. It's not the best luck, but I'm outside because I'm working from home, keeping all the dogs inside, and excited to be here. So we'll continue on. We don't stop for anything. Even if somebody's sick, we're excited to talk about ICS roles. And I'll tell you why. On the Business of Cyber, we always talk about three very core resources that are pressuring the industry. The first is we don't have enough people in the game. The second is with the requisite skill set of ICS, OT, cybersecurity in general. The next is we just don't have enough budget. We don't have enough budget coming downstream from key stakeholders, technical owners, non-technical owners, and we don't have enough time. And when you put all those three things together, what I think the pressure that a lot of people feel right now is OT cybersecurity programs are not launching as well as they could, not as fast as they could. I think if you talk to any asset owner out there, they wish that they could do a little bit more. And so what I found very cool, very enticing about our initial conversation was half the time it comes down to somebody needing a role that they don't have, right?
Mhm.
And you're in the business of creating those roles. And I thought that this was going to be an awesome experience. So if you're tuning in live, or if you're watching this after the fact, we're going to be talking today about how do you get budget? How do you get the right resources up the chain of command so that you can get the role that you need? Is that fair enough, Arely?
Yeah, 100%. And I totally agree with those 3 points. And I think it becomes an issue of, well, it's kind of the same way as they look at their environments, right? If it's not broke, don't touch it. If we can't do anything about it, let's just not think about it. So it's about getting them to think about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. And then we're going to just dive into 7 or 8 different slides, right? So understanding the ICS environment, the importance of the ICS expertise. You're in the business of helping people share that expertise. So I'd love to understand that. But then we get right into building a strong business case and these key skills, qualifications. ROI is tough in this industry. A lot of people don't agree with ROI. I do. You just have to kind of frame it the right way. As always, if you're listening live, you can put a chat message in and we'll be able to see it and okay if we can share it, but very excited to dive in. So Arely, tell us a little bit about you, your experience. How'd you find yourself in this current role and what takes up most of your day?
Yeah, so I actually started my recruitment journey when I was when I started in, I was doing pen testing and red team recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
So very far out from OT ICS. I was more on the IT side, doing like web, mobile, cloud, that sort of stuff. And I met an industrial pen tester, and I just kept coming across people who were doing more like hardware hacking, embedded systems hacking. And I was like, that sounds really interesting. And I had a good friend that recommended me to the industry. He just liked the care that I took with representing him. Also, just how much passion I had for what I was learning through the technical side. And he was like, we could really use someone like you in this industry. I looked into it, I did some research, and it didn't take too long for me to get sold on it. So I was at Lawrence Harvey for almost 2 years, where I went from junior to senior recruitment consultant. And I actually just recently left Lawrence Harvey to pivot into the industry. So now I'm at Apex, which is a satellite bus manufacturing company. I am one of their technical recruiters, helping them find some pretty niche skill sets, but I'm still a resource to the OTICS side of things, mostly because I think it would be a waste for me to just completely step away from the industry. And also, I don't think I'll ever lose the passion that everyone has within this community, right? Like that's going to follow me for the rest of my life. So that's how I ended up doing this and why I'm talking to you today.
Yeah. Everybody has a different path, right? So like coming into industrial control system, critical sectors, OT, there's tons of different ways. Like I came in from the, believe it or not, quality control realm. I used to do quality control inspections, which moved to audits of downhole tool failures, which moved to quality control, which moved to quality assurance, which then moved into risk management. And so I have a risk background, right? Some automation side, some people come in from the IT side. I think in the pre-call, one of the things that you said, which was really interesting, is we just need great people in this industry, and people that had been industry juggernauts working at some really big companies for a really long time, actually told you, hey, you should look more into this, because the industry needed somebody who was really passionate about what they're doing. So really exciting. Just out of curiosity, when you're helping place personnel, when you're looking for people to join the ICS industry, what's one of the top things that you found really works? Like what's unique about ICS that keeps you motivated every day when you come to work?
I think for me, it's understanding the impact, right? Like, I think it's like an invisible workforce that we just take for granted. Growing up, I never really thought about, hey, who keeps my lights on? Like, who keeps us safe? Who keeps me able to go to the store and get as many products as I want? Like, who keeps this running? And it was always a matter of like, oh, it's the businesses, like they're
Right.
providing product, all of this. And once I knew that there were people on the cybersecurity side that were essentially kind of cleaning up the mess of like, we didn't care about this before and now we have to.
Right.
That was just really exciting for me. I think I've always wanted to have personal impact in whatever I do. And the passion that people have in this industry, it carries and it motivates me as well. I don't think I could work with people who hate what they do and like it would just be
There's a
awful.
lot of that, though. I mean, a lot of people, I think what you're trying to say is people in ICS, they don't treat it so much as a job as they do maybe a calling or a mission. Would you agree to that?
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. It's definitely a mission and it drives everything that they do. And there's always, even when there's disagreements, I've noticed in this industry, it's almost always a conversation. It's not you're
Yeah.
wrong, I'm right. Like it's always trying to build towards something. And I think that is something that I just always really appreciated and respected about the industry, and it kept me around for sure.
Yeah, it makes sense. So, understanding the ICS environment, how does that, and then just kind of combining the two, like the importance of ICS expertise, as we think about these two like talking points,
Mhm.
what do you think is important for people to understand about the ICS environment as it relates to recruiting and getting a role into their company?
I think honestly, usually across the industry, I feel like the more exposure you have to different environments, whether it's because you come from a consultancy background or you've taken the responsibility of the environment wherever you're at, if it's a manufacturing company, just having your eyes on as many things as possible is really important. Having that oversight and understanding and not really being so siloed. We do need industry specific things, but I think being more generalist is actually really helpful in this case because those skill sets are translational. You can talk, it's easier to also make a business case to an executive when you have a more general understanding than when you're really siloed, because it's harder to relate and understand someone who speaks about something so specifically if you're not an expert in that, right? Being more general and more broad with your understanding of the environment, on taking the first step of even understanding what you have in your environment is really important, and having that experience end to end of doing like the asset inventory to remediation is super important. So I think that's probably one of the ways in which it'll help people the most in being able to get a role or create a role, is just being able to communicate, this is what the environment looks like. You're not an engineer or you're not a network person, but being able to explain it in layman's terms is super important.
What role do you find that you're working for the most? Are you brought on by CISO requiring an OT director role? Is it an OT director role that's finding somebody else? Walk me through some of the org structure that you see on a regular basis.
I think it depends on the maturity level of the security program. So a lot of the times, yeah, like a lot of the times, if it's a manufacturing company who's never had anyone in this sort of position, it'll usually be an OT network engineer or an OT security architect. And it will be someone who's that for a year or two and then will quickly change into a manager or a director. It's just that first key hire needs to be really technical and still hands-on, right? Because they're going to be doing a lot of the remediation and deployment themselves. So it doesn't help these companies to bring in a director or a manager. On the flip side, if it is a bigger company and they have a more mature program, a lot of the time it's bringing in a director or a manager or even a VP with an OT background and not just an IT background is one of the things that I see a lot. Is people in cybersecurity, a lot of the time they come from the IT side, and in these environments that have these giant operating systems, they can't speak to the OT engineers. They can't bridge that gap. And so companies are like, well, where do we find people who can bridge that gap and understand and don't have to upskill? And that's what I see on that side. So it's kind of a double-sided coin in that sense.
Sure. Yeah, I think that I agree with your point that more and more we're finding there is a law of diminishing returns when it comes to your specific engineering or OT expertise to help the business. What do I mean? One of the things that I think correlates with what you said earlier about OT and ICS roles being more of a mission-driven, a value-driven job rather than just a paycheck is that you've got folks that have been working there 20, 30 years. You got people that have worked 10 or 15 years. That's a lot in today's world. And a lot of these folks have been extremely focused on the engineering, the automation, not the commercial side of the house, not the P&L side of the house. They've been laser focused on just the OT equipment and the OT processes that they've been under control. So if you have somebody that is so far focused on that, I think that they can have limitations in talking to leadership. On the flip side is if you bring somebody in that doesn't have any of that engineering expertise and never has really set up ICS environments, never really looked at the full breadth of application and the methodology of how all these systems are are laid out, then they're not going to understand the OT environment very well. So I do think it's a balance. Very, very well. So what's the number one challenge you think folks are having? Is it that as we think about bringing on a role, if the next question I asked you was, how do you bring somebody onto the role? What's the foundational issue that these companies are having that creates a problem for bringing on a role? Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. So I think the most difficult thing is whether a company is motivated by compliance or if it's motivated by actually doing something, right? Like, is a company just trying to check off a box? Are they saying the regulations are changing really quickly, I want to keep up with that, but I'm not really motivated I don't think there's a case for there ever being a hack or the system going down or anything like that. It's never going to affect us, but I just want to make sure we're compliant. So in that sense, when leadership has that mindset, that's a huge limiting factor for bringing on someone with that skill set, because a lot of the times the best talent doesn't want to go somewhere like that anyways. So even if they're motivated to bring someone on, it's difficult to fill a role when you're telling people, you're just here and you're going to sit on your hands and maybe like tell us what we need to do. We're not going to do it.
What should we do, but don't get any resources for it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a huge limiting factor for those types of companies. And unfortunately for them, if they work with a recruiter like me, I do ask those questions because I think it's important to tell the talent, right? Like, this is the sort of place that you're going to be at. But it also makes it really hard for them to find people because, again, these people are mission oriented. They care about what they're doing. They don't just want to sit somewhere and collect paychecks. So that's tough on that side of things. And then I think another thing is a lot of companies don't even really know what to look for. So they don't know what the titles are. They don't know what the skill sets are. They've got this vague idea of kind of what they need, especially if their C-suite, if their CISO or their CIO doesn't come from a background that understands maybe what's needed and has upskilled themselves. They don't even know where to start. Like, I've gotten on calls before with companies where they tell me that they need one thing and I get to the bottom of it and it's actually they need something completely different, right?
Yeah.
So just even understanding.
I totally understand what you're saying. You're saying that if the overall maturity level, the education level in ICS or OT or cybersecurity for critical sectors, if that educational level or if that support level at the higher levels isn't there, then you really don't have a foundation for building a strong case. Okay, that's fair. One on the opposite, what are the best companies that OT or ICS people want to work for? I mean, I think I know, but I'm just from your perspective, what's the best?
I think right now, smart manufacturing is pretty exciting, right? People want to upskill in integrating generative AI, digital transformations, that sort of stuff. That's really exciting. People want to move into that. And I think it's a path that people know that if they take it, it's not a dying skill set, if you will. Like it's an emerging skill set. I think that one's really important. But I think for all of the people who just want to create change and impact and know that they're having like a day-to-day impact on a company, one of the, or I guess two of the biggest industries that are changing pretty quickly are energy, and that includes like utilities and renewables. And that's mostly because of regulations and now this whole buzz around safety, right? Like I think everyone's on the same page. Our critical infrastructure's in a pretty uh, sad state. And we've not paid attention for it for a really long time, and we didn't know how to. And putting it online and having remote access and all of these things has changed that. Like now we actually have to care about it a lot more. And so if you want to go into an industry where you're going to have a lot of impact and things are changing very quickly and there's money being put towards it, I think renewables and utilities is one of them. And utilities historically hasn't been like that, but now everything, the government's giving them money, they're paying attention to it more. They're getting hacked more, which is probably part of the reason. So those are industries I think people would be excited to work in because there's so much career growth, and they're in an infancy stage a lot of the time. So you can really get that experience end to end, as opposed to coming into a company that's done all this work and you're kind of just going in there to like spruce things up.
Yeah. One of the things we had somebody on a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, that was interviewing for CISO roles, and interviewing him, the questions were, how wild is it interviewing for CISO roles in the critical sectors right now? And the disparity between some companies saying, I need you to come in and do patch management, versus the other folks saying, you're not going to have any personnel on your team, but I want you to do all these things. I think it's what I would call a buyer's market. With a very limited number of roles probably available. And that means I think that if you interview the company very effectively, you're going to find out really fast if they're going to give you the resources you need, if they got the right mindset. And I think a lot of people right now, they need work. They've got to stay engaged. And so I think some people are taking roles knowing full well they're not going to get the resources. But they're taking the role anyway because of either the title or because they need to make money, or they need to just stay engaged. What do you think about that, Arely? Is that true? Is that happening, you think?
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a huge shortage for C-suite and executive roles right now, especially in OT-ICS. I think that's true across all tech.
You're saying that some companies that probably could make a role haven't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And a lot of the times I've actually worked with companies who have created roles or have been very transparent about wanting to hire a CISO with an OT background, which has been interesting because I don't think historically that's been too popular or even something that people prioritize necessarily.
Right.
So it's just interesting to see like the shift in that sense, but the demand and the space for jobs just hasn't caught up. And I think it really is translating that need into a reality of, we know we need this, but it's just too much work to figure out. And we don't have the network for it. And we don't really know how to do that. So we're just going to coast by. Well,
I think they're putting more pressure on the sites, right? So like one of the things that I've always talked about is you got an IT organization. IT organization wants to come in and do an assessment. What do? They do corporate wide. They bring in a bunch of consultants. They're sitting there for 3 months and they give this risk picture of the company. You've got to do almost the exact opposite in OT and ICS. You actually have to say, no, we're going to break down our facilities by criticality to the overall business outcome. We're going to do 2 of these, 2 of these, 2 of these, and we're going to do them all over the world. And you go facility level. Well, in my opinion, where I think a lot of the dollars are flowing is when people look at that and they do that, they're saying, I need more help at my facility level. So what you're doing is you're taking an automation person, maybe you're taking an IT person and you're cross-training that individual to start being your OT cyber person on the ground. And I think there's a struggle right now where people are trying to get dollars from corporate or dollars from the facilities for that role versus dollars at the higher end role. What say you?
I agree. And I think that people at that lower level and more on site they are not even being told to do this. They're taking the responsibility onto themselves. The amount of people in those types of roles that I've spoken to who are upskilling, self-training, because they're seeing it in real time, right? Like they're there day to day and they're like, hey, this doesn't feel like what we should be doing. We should be more careful. We should be doing this. We should be segmenting in these ways. Like they're kind of all seeing this and training themselves and making themselves those unicorns. And a lot of the times that doesn't necessarily come with budget from uphill. It's something that they have to go ask for, and they don't even know how to ask for it, but they're upskilling themselves. And I've seen that a lot. And those are typically some of the best talent that you can get in the market. Those are the people I'm trying to pull out of companies to take them to other companies because they've upskilled themselves. They typically come from that engineering background. That one person at that manufacturing plant who's handling everything and hasn't needed to be told to handle it, has themselves critically thought about it. They're great talent to move anywhere. But it's really unfortunate that that's kind of the reality of the industry. They're not getting the support. They have to do everything themselves.
Yeah.
And when they do finally get upskilled like that, they're not getting paid for that skill set either. So it's just kind of unfortunate all around in that sense.
So let's talk departments, because we've got some comments going by and it's all on the same theme. It goes, you got an IT department. We know that all these companies have had IT departments. You've got a CISO and a CIO. Let's say you got both. You've got operations, who typically owns the majority of the budget. And then there's this new department called OT. Now, I've seen OT as a tangential component of the IT team. I've seen OT be its own standalone function, which owns its own security. And I've seen OT report to both. I've also seen no OT teams. And I think that that's what we're seeing the most of. We're seeing one OT person maybe being attached somewhere. Where do you see the industry right now on an OT specific role? Do you see that IT is asking for it more, or do you see that operations people are asking for it more? And where do you see the reporting structure maybe not working the best, but just sheer numbers? Who's asking for this role the most, and where's it reporting?
I think IT's asking for it more, surprisingly, mostly because budget typically falls for cybersecurity under that. So
Right, I agree.
that's really where they're looking for it. I would say I mostly see OT being like the baby brother of IT, just like this small group of people that work with IT don't necessarily report into like an IT manager. They'll typically report straight up into a VP or a CISO or a CIO, just because IT doesn't really understand in that sense. The middle managers can't really manage something that they don't understand.
Right. Yeah,
but
it's funny. I think you're right. I think that there were some industry groups that said that the majority of, let's say, OT security budgets are going to fall under the CIO and the CISO by 2026, whatever that number was. That ended up being accurate, I think. I also think the number one reason OT vendors, specifically the big market incumbents that have deployed hundreds of millions over the course of the last 5 years, the reason they're struggling right now is because many of the initial purchases that were made were not under IT really purview or control. They were under operations control. They were under some OT business unit. As those business units now start having to report over to IT, there's a fundamental, maybe it's lack of understanding, maybe it's lack of some sort of return on investment, maybe it's because there hasn't been a kinetic attack for the organization. But we're seeing record churn on a lot of these different products and services. Budgets just are not increasing at the same rate I think the threats are. And I think it's because a lot of these business units are now reporting to IT. Mm-hmm. So if we look at that, and you don't have to agree or disagree, but if we just look at the fact, which is there are more OT budgets falling under IT right now, we agree on that, right? Mm-hmm. How do you get an OT role sold? If whether you're an IT person and you don't know OT, or whether you're an OT person working for IT and you say, I need more help, how do you really get that key stakeholder buy-in to get that role kind of taken out. And this building this strong business case is what I'm looking to do here.
Yeah, I think honestly, it's a tough question to answer. There's a lot of things that you can think about. So I think one is talking about actual events that have happened. So one of the biggest ones for me that I talked about with manufacturing companies was the Clorox one, right? Like that happened pretty recently. That affected their bottom line pretty badly. And that's not just an IT issue or an OT issue or this issue or that issue. It's a company issue. I think they lost over 300 million in cost and damages to that. And that just was in slowdown of production, them not being able to see who was ordering. That's an IT problem a lot of the time. The orders being delayed, them not knowing how much they needed to be making. I think it's really one of the best arguments that you can make for bringing someone in is finding someone who can speak both languages, like finding that bridger and presenting them to them. So a lot of the times what I would do is I would say, hey, I have this really great person. Are you hiring for this role? And they'd be like, we've thought about it. We don't really know. We don't have a need. And I would just say, let's have an informal conversation with them. Have an informal conversation with this person who has an understanding of both and can bridge that gap. Let them talk to you and kind of sell you on it. And once they understand that even though OT and IT are so different, they're vastly moving in a similar direction and getting more crossed over. And they see the value of having someone who understands both worlds really well. It was almost a much easier conversation to continue from there. And I also think it was just not being so pushy with like, this is what you need. It's more so like, hey, why don't you just have a conversation and understand? Because a lot of the times it is not understanding what value they can bring to you and not giving that a chance and thinking a lot of the times on the IT side, if we're impenetrable as a network, then this shouldn't even be an issue, right? But it's getting them to understand that you're not always impenetrable as a network. And if you're not, then what are you going to do?
Yeah.
That's really where you can get them to buy into more of it. And a lot of the time was just telling them, why don't you hire a contractor? See the value that they bring for you. You don't have to hire someone full time. Why are you paying a consultancy $400 an hour to come in and tell you what to do when you can hire someone directly to do it for you? And then you'll see the value of it and be able to hire them full time. And that's an argument that was made pretty frequently a lot of the times because these companies think that the experts are at these giant consultancies. And a lot of the times they're not.
And when you look at, so it sounds like help make the business case that there's a unique language model out there and there's a very few number of people that can do it effectively. You've got to bridge the gap between what's happening on the ground at your sites. What's the impact of digitization? What's the impact of having the same software, hardware at all your sites? The layered issues of compliance. I mean, all these things at the shop floor level or at the rig level, and being able to communicate that back to the CISO. So you're saying that a CISO with IT experience is going to benefit from an OT experienced person who can bridge the gap both sides?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah,
well, I agree with you. I agree. So you're talking about one of the business cases is we need to improve our language model as it relates to security. I could see that. And you also talked about the business impact side, like not having a good understanding of that has material business impacts. I agree. You didn't bring up threats. You didn't bring up incident response. You didn't bring up any of the big buzzwords, which is where I think you and I align. I think that you're not going to create more budget by telling everybody there's more risks. I think you're going to create budget by telling people that our risk model as an organization is different because this is how we laid out our business operations. I think that's the biggest problem that ICS has. Rigs may function generally the same, but the infrastructure might be different on every one of them. Chemical facilities might generally produce the same product, but the different zones and conduits that they built have been very different across the globe. So I think that's the biggest problem in having this hierarchical structure that's repeatable. Is that wastewater might do it different than utilities, and that utility might do it different than this one. So the reason that we have recruiting issues, the reason that we have a pipeline of people issues, I think it comes down to the unique architecture and structure and org structures of these companies. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think that a lot of the time, I mean, it's hard. These people come in. I think, well, one, I do think it's an organizational structure, but I also think it's a pay problem, right? I think there's a huge discrepancy between people on the IT side and on the OT security side and
Dive
how
into that.
they're paid and how they're valued.
Dive into that. I did a post the other day. Look, I don't track all my metrics, but I did a post that said CISOs need to get paid more.
Mhm.
Arely, it was like 6 times more views than anything else I've ever done in the history of my LinkedIn. And I don't know, maybe people agreed, but it's definitely a hot topic. What do you mean when you say that there's a pay disparity?
I think I completely agree with you. Anytime I posted about people getting paid more and how companies don't value multiple skill sets but are demanding multiple skill sets, those were my posts that did the best because it's true. I think when I spoke to companies, when I was speaking to stakeholders and they were saying, hey, we need this person with this skill set, we need a VP with this, or we need an OT security architect that's got all of this experience, and they would give me a salary range. It was almost like I could tell them then and there if I was going to find them someone or not that was
Because
worth
they were too low.
anything. Yeah, 100%. Like they would want an OT security architect that was a senior, that had done end-to-end work, like had taken a company through their infancy of their security program through now like a digital transformation or whatever's going on, and that they see in their like 2 to 3 to 5 year plan. And I was like, okay, great. That's going to cost you $200,000 on base if you want like a really good person to do that. And you want one person to lead this and probably contract people out. It's going to be pretty expensive. And they would be like, well, why, these people typically make 150 and 160 on the senior side. And I mean, it was just like shocking to me, and having to have that really transparent conversation of I can find you someone that maybe makes less, but I feel like one, they're not getting paid enough, and two, they're probably not going to be as motivated to want to
Not if they
drive.
get in there, they don't have any resources.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, you take somebody technical, take somebody early adopter, take somebody that knows what they need to do to fix the problem, and then give them no money. I mean, that's what we have in the industry. I see it all the time. I say, hey, look, we brought you on, and we paid above market or above what we had as our market. And then they don't give them any resources to fix stuff. I see it all the time. I came out with an article about 4 years ago that said one of the first things you should do when you start an assessment program or an assessment journey is figure out exactly how much budget you're going to have at the end of that journey, because you're going to have all these issues, all these remediations. Why would you go and assess at a very, very deep layer or a very, very deep control set if you know you don't have the budget to fix it?
Yeah.
So,
no, and I think it's confusing as well because a lot of these companies will pay big consultancies to come in, do an assessment, and fix their problems, but they don't want to allocate that budget to the individuals that they hire directly to do it for them. It's almost like they don't see that value being brought on by that skill set. And
yeah,
that's what's confused. That was always confusing to me when I spoke to people. I was just like, you're even saving money by hiring someone directly to do it because you're
I've
not.
seen it. I've seen $50,000 and $100,000 projects that were laser focused. They were outcome oriented. They were expert driven. And I've seen them get rolled over by $400,000 or $500,000 project by a major consulting firm. And 6-8 months later, there's no output that's really actionable.
Yeah. Well, I think consulting firms, like, although they have their upsides, and I'm sure they're not going to be happy to hear this, they're these huge process companies that have too many red tape lines. There's not enough communication between the teams. I have friends who work at these companies, right? And I know what it's like internally, and the communication between the different teams, not being able to get on the same page, not scoping accurately is a huge problem as well. Like they don't have a lot of the time industry experts that can come in and give a true scope of what it's going to look like. And so then at the end, they're scrambling to be like, all right, well, we've said it's going to cost this much. So like, how can we cut down on our cost to try to get it to something done so that we feel like we're within that scope? But it's because a lot of the times they've already run through in the last 20 years all of the best people in the industry who weren't happy working there. And so now, they've got younger people or Yeah, who don't have as much experience. But because companies know these big names, they're like, okay, well, then we trust them, but it's just so backwards. Like in OT security, it's almost like you should be going for the smaller consultancies that were started by the OGs, not these giant
100%.
conglomerates.
100%.
It just doesn't make sense.
It's starting to happen. It's starting to happen with hardware and software vendors too. What's happening is a lot of people follow the money. A lot of people follow the brand. A lot of people feel, well, if I hire that consultant, I buy that product from that major brand name, I'll never get in trouble. But look at what's happening. Sometimes the brand names are not the best option, right? When the brand name gets compromised or they're in every computer system out there, we've seen the issues with that. Like I'm not a proponent of not going with a big guy. I'm a proponent of don't overspend when you don't have to. And I feel that it takes some guts to be an IT or an OT leader in critical sectors right now, because you've got to stand up to your board. You got to stand up to your C-suite and say, hey, look, that might be what we do on the IT side. That might be what we do on the auditing side. That might be what we do on the governance side. But at that site right there and that site right over there, we need some real experts. And I've said this once and I'll say it again. I think that the strongest players in the industry right now are small niche player consultancies, small niche player software and hardware companies that know exactly where they fit. They know exactly how to serve, and working with those organizations, they know what their left and right limits are. I think specialty is going to drive security in the long term. I think some of these bigger companies, it's a little bit of a waste of cash sometimes by bringing such a large monster in to do everything. It'll take too long. Very cool. So switching back to your slides real quick, I wanted to cover one of these points. How do you engage stakeholders really well? We've talked about it, but you mentioned earlier, if you can get the right person on the phone with them, they open their eyes a little bit, right? What are the other stakeholders that you need to get on board to get a new role created? And how do you approach them?
So for me, a lot of the times my outreach was to C-suite. CEOs, funnily enough, were easier to crack than CISOs or CIOs. And I don't know if it was maybe like a I know best kind of mindset of I've already done the research, like we don't need to be doing that. With CEOs, I don't know if there's not a lot of the time a transparent communication, or like, do they have meetings where they talk about like, hey, this is what's happening in the industry, these are the risks, these are the things, or if it's very siloed. But I found a lot of the times in my outreach, when I send out emails or I would talk to people on the phone, I would talk about, especially in renewables, like regulations and how fast they're changing, and especially in Europe, right? Like with NIS2, that was a big one that I would reach out to CEOs and say, hey, do you have assets in Europe? If you do, like, have you heard of NIS2? Like, how up to date are you on all these regulations? And so many, like, I had a few that were like, I've never heard of this. Like, what is this? And I thought that's a communication issue internally, right? Where something's not being communicated. I don't know, like, who are they handling it on their side? Do they have a team that's doing it? But it's almost like not, I think security should be a CEO problem. And I think it should be at the forefront, especially in utilities and in energy specifically, because it's being driven. I mean, our president's like giving out executive orders, like all of these things. If it's on the forefront of the White House's mind, I think it should be on the forefront of business owners who run energy companies, for sure, at the very least. And it was interesting to talk to them about regulations, and they didn't know a lot of the changes that were being made. And that was easier to get attention from stakeholders, if you will, than it was to going directly to a CISO. I feel like the CISOs were almost like, we've already thought about it. We have a plan in place, and that plan may be to do nothing for now, and we'll do something in the future.
Yeah.
It was a more difficult conversation to have with them than it was to have with.
I find that I like your point, and I'll bring up a point. If the CISO is creating the idea for the role, that's the person you go after because they're already bought in. But if they haven't thought of the role, it's almost as if they don't want to hear from you because they're like, hey, we already got this covered and I didn't think of it. I find that all the time. I also find that I find that CEOs, CFOs, COOs, operational managers, if they own the budget, I've even seen it where they take a role or they take an item to the CISO and they say, we're ready to buy this. But if the CISO or the security leader didn't come up with that themselves, it gets shut down. I think the CEO might be able to change the mind. But I think we have in a lot of times an ego problem at the security leader level. And I think that's the first step is if I was going to create a role somewhere, I'd want to be working for a C-suite that understands that, probably going to have to put more dollars in and probably going to have to think outside the box. And I see that as an issue sometimes.
Yeah. And to your point about the CFOs, a lot of the times the approach that I would take in that sense was cutting out consultancy cost and giving them real values. I worked with a couple of oil and gas companies who I helped cut out big consultancies and hire contractors directly and saved them 60+% of what they were spending on that talent just by hiring them directly. Like imagine cutting your cost in half just because you hire someone directly as opposed to bringing in a big consultancy to do it. And even just opening their eyes to the layers of what the talent industry looks like. Like, when you do hire one of these companies, they hire a consultancy and that consultancy hires a contractor and you're paying all this overhead cost. And a lot of these companies don't know that. Like they're like, oh, I thought these were employees of this consultancy. No, they're not. And I can go get
a sub of a sub of a sub of a sub of a sub.
Exactly. And it's because they can't hire those people because they're not interested in working there. So opening their eyes to that and putting a dollar value on it and really outlining that to a CFO and even a CEO, that is super valuable to them and they appreciate it because
do you find, so I have an opinion here, but do you find that the cycles of maturity for your given end customer or the asset owner, that there's a perfect time to bring in a new ICS or OT role?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a good time, honestly, at any time they're doing any sort of updating on anything. I think it's important if they're getting new systems, if they're getting in any sort of, even on the IT side, they're deploying some sort of new technology or whatever. I think that's a great time to bring someone in. I also think it's a really good time to start bringing talent in at the end of the year when you have leftover budget and you don't know what to do with it. That's the like recruitment strategy in any industry, is to reach out to companies at that time, say how much budget.
Because they can use some OpEx money for the recruiting fees.
Yeah, exactly. Or even just to create a role internally instead of letting that money go to waste. And we see that a lot, and especially when I would work with companies and they needed OT network engineers or whatever, they would hire them at the end of the year as contractors because that contract budget, they would lose it. And they were just like, we need to use it. Where do we use it? And they would use it at that time. So I think if you're internally at a company and you want to make a case for it, that's probably a pretty good time to make a case for it because there's probably money left over to do it.
Makes sense. Well, we're coming up on time. I could talk about this all day. I enjoy this conversation. I think it comes down to people, Arely. I think that you've got to have an open mind at the top of the tree, and you've got to have enough qualified people coming up. And I think we have challenges on both sides. It's, one thing that you talked about was the value of having this OT-minded leader talking to the C-suite. And sometimes that unlocks a role. But I think we'd be foolish if we thought that everybody with OT experience was going to be able to bridge that gap effectively, right? I think that's a limitation on the supply side. The demand side, I think it very much has to do with a journey. I think that companies, don't get me wrong, I think that an OT or ICS security-minded person coming in as a full-time employee or a full-time contractor makes perfect sense at any time if they have a budget to support that person with. But I also think that within the first 100 days or the first 150 days of a new CISO coming in, they've established an assessment of what is there. They've tied in with digitization. They've tied in with operations. They've tied in with their existing security infrastructure. And they're likely going to put a 2 to 3 year plan in place. And I think that there's a window of opportunity to get a role established, because how the CISO goes and buys solutions, whether it's through an OEM, whether it's through an integrator, or whether it's direct with the product companies, I think there's a heavy, heavy value that competes against an OT person being on site. And that is, why not have the OEMs or the product companies offer services to implement, maintain? And I think that right now you have a lot of these existing market players on the vendor side who are having a challenge selling their products, and they're filling up the revenue gap with services. Mm-hmm. So I think that CISOs have a lot on their plate right now. They're saying, well, I could just buy a bunch of services from these industry players, or I can get my own person. And I think, even though we didn't talk about it much, I think that's a very real balance that the CISOs are having to make up in their minds right now.
Yeah, I agree. And I was going to say this earlier, actually, but the best people sometimes to bring on are the sales engineers. If you are going to hire someone directly, is a sales engineer, because they are technical and they can speak the language and they can speak the layman terms, and they've got that experience because they're client facing. So those people sometimes are some of the best people to bring on. And no, I completely agree with you. I think if it's not in their plan from the beginning, it's really difficult to make a case for it in the future. But again, I think that comes down to also them having the knowledge of it needing to be in the plan in the first place. So having that background and that upskilling themselves and caring about having that security in place is really important. And yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the big companies that do come in and offer the services as well as the products, it's an easier route to take, right? It's almost like off their plate. They just brought someone in to do it. And I can understand why some people would take that route over wanting to build out their own team.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, I'll give you the last word. I'm excited to share this with our collective audiences. I thought this was a great conversation. It speaks to the challenge the industry has. And I appreciate the hard work that you're doing out there to tell this story. I'll give you the final word on maybe ways folks can reach out to you, or what you'd like to share with the industry.
Yeah. So, I mean, I still am definitely a resource, and I welcome anyone that reaches out to me. Whether it's for advice as an entry-level person or a senior person looking for a job, like, I'm always here as a resource to you guys. And I will continue to be for as long as I can be. And hopefully even on the company side, if this is a conversation that you're having internally and it's difficult and you're actually ready to make the hire, but you don't know where to find them, then you know where to find me, and I can help you connect to the right people.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Arely. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ted. You've been watching the Business of Cyber series. Join us next Tuesday, 10 a.m. for another installment. Go have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ted.